everybody, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jill, otherwise known as the Enlightened Target, and this channel is devoted to narcissistic abuse awareness and recovery, parental alienation, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and anything and everything associated with those three main topics. Today we are talking about a condition that can happen to a victim after long-term exposure to narcissistic abuse. Today we're talking about something called learned helplessness. So if you have heard this term before and wondered what it's about, today's video is for you. If you're new to my channel, I would like to take a minute and welcome you and invite you to please subscribe and be sure and hit that notification bell because I put out new videos every week. Also, if you are interested in private one-on-one narcissistic abuse recovery coaching with me, please visit my website or send me an email. Both are linked in the description below. So today we're talking about a condition that can happen to a victim after long-term exposure to narcissistic abuse. The condition is called learned helplessness. So first let me explain what the clinical definition is. Essentially how this condition came to be was way back in the day when experimenting on animals was acceptable, which is horrible and heartbreaking. But back in those days, I believe it was the 60s, two scientists noticed a specific behavior that dogs displayed when they were subjected to an adverse or painful stimulus that they could not escape. Eventually, what they found was that the dog will stop trying to avoid the stimulus and behave as if it is completely helpless to avoid or change the situation, even when opportunities to escape were present. After long-term exposure to this painful stimulus, the dogs seemed to accept and believe that there wasn't anything they could do about it, even when it was obvious they could get out of the area that they were in. This is how the term learned helplessness was born. Later on, they realized that this behavior can occur in human beings when a person feels as if they have no control over their situation. And clearly, being involved in a narcissistically abusive relationship, whether this is a parent, a partner, an employer, or a sibling, victims feel powerless. That is the nature of an abusive relationship. The victim feels powerless, which of course is the goal of the abuser. Again, narcissistically abusive relationships are primarily about power and control. How many times have you heard or wondered if a person being abused heard the question, why don't they just leave? Why don't they leave the relationship? And learned helplessness may be a part of the reason. Typically, there will be other issues at play here as well, being in a trauma-bonded relationship being one of them. However, part of the problem very well could be learned helplessness. Another reason that learned helplessness is a condition that many long-term victims of narcissistic abuse experience is because at the core of narcissistic abuse is psychological and emotional abuse. So victims are exposed to enormous amounts of being told that they are worthless, that they can't make it without the narcissist, that the abuse is their fault. Many times victims of narcissistic abuse are told that they are crazy, or they shift blame onto the victim, gaslighting them so severely that the victim comes to believe that they are the problem, that they are the responsible party for the reaction and the abuse that they're being exposed to. Of course, this doesn't happen overnight, but with repetitive and long-term exposure, this can have devastating consequences on the victim's perceptions about reality or their ability to leave and survive on their own. I've had clients of mine in the past send me videos of the narcissist in a full-blown rage and clearly abusing the victim. And they have asked me to review the video to see if it actually is abuse and if it is or is not their fault. This is how severely our understanding of reality can be manipulated and distorted by these people. When you are exposed to years of psychological and emotional abuse, you can see how learned helplessness could become a condition that victims suffer from. Unfortunately, there is a percentage of victims who will succumb to the narcissist's version of reality and will actually believe that they are powerless and that they don't have any other options available to them other than to indefinitely endure the abuse they're being exposed to. another point on how learned helplessness can develop, and one of the most devastating consequences of being exposed to narcissistic abuse is the level of self-betrayal that is necessary to survive. Essentially, victims have to give up on defending themselves, on being loyal to themselves, and at a certain point must accept the narrative that the narcissist is feeding them, because it is dangerous if we don't. Therefore, if and when an opportunity presents itself for a victim to leave or get away, it can feel overwhelming. The level of self-doubt can be too consuming. Many times we have become dependent on the narcissist to tell us what is true, what is real, and what is happening. So to expect this person to be able to just turn on the self-reliance after being exposed to the extremes of narcissistic abuse is just not a reasonable expectation. So the next time you hear someone say, "Why doesn't so-and-so just leave the abusive relationship?" take into consideration that the victim may very well be living with learned helplessness. So why do some people develop learned helplessness and some people exposed to the same level of abuse don't develop learned helplessness? There is some research to suggest that a person's explanatory style may have something to do with it. This view suggests that an individual characteristic style of explaining events helps determine whether or not a person will develop learned helplessness. If the person has a generally pessimistic explanatory style, meaning they have a negative outlook on to the events that have happened in their life, these people tend to view negative events as being inescapable and unavoidable, and that can have an impact on whether or not they develop this condition. And in my opinion, this would be the majority of victims who are exposed to long-term narcissistic abuse. Narcissistic abuse and complex PTSD go hand in hand. And one of the most devastating consequences of being exposed to this level of prolonged abuse is the birth of what's called the inner critic. Many victims who develop Cptsd from narcissistic abuse internalize the abuser's voice as their own and will maintain an inner dialogue that is abusive, meaning if their abuser has told them that they are unworthy, at fault, too stupid to do anything on their own, they eventually will be talking to themselves in this manner. So much of healing from complex PTSD involves eliminating that inner critic and replacing it with a loving and kind inner dialogue, because in my experience, healing will evade a victim until this happens. But you can certainly see how having a nasty inner critic could contribute to a person developing learned helplessness. The good news is that learned helplessness can be overcome. With help and intervention from a professional who understands this condition, the success rate is really good for victims unlearning learned helplessness. The first stage is understanding that this condition exists and is fairly common in narcissistically abusive relationships, and that learned helplessness can be unlearned under the right circumstances. Okay, that's going to do it for today's video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. Also, follow me on Instagram. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, everyone.